Thank you, Luke, for that very characteristically generous introduction. And also, before I get started, I wanted to be sure to thank Luke and Jeremy and Matt for putting on such a kind of stimulating and fun week. It's hard to believe it's already been a week that we've been here. It's been great to collaborate on hackathon projects with you guys, and I've had a really great time getting to know a lot of you and sort of getting to know a lot of what you guys are working on, both the hackathon and just in general. And so I'm going to try, I guess, to return the favor a little bit. Hopefully you enjoy it. And in the next 45 minutes or so, I'll tell you about some of the work that I've been doing. And also, before I get started, I want to be sure to thank the other people who've had a hand in the work I'll tell you about, especially Talia and our collaborator, Adam here at Dartmouth, as well as the members of my lab at UCLA. Some of them are pictured here on our lab hike, who have contributed to a lot of the more recent work that I'll tell you about actually pretty briefly, because a lot of that's more work in progress. And so the theme of this week is naturalistic context, right? And I think that one of the most important and complicated and still pretty mysterious aspects of our just everyday real world social context is the structure of our social world. Oh yeah, I'll stay closer to the mic. And even in social neuroscience, where we're ostensibly interested in studying how people understand and interact with the social world, we tend to study people who are alone in these isolated, noisy tubes, as Talia alluded to. And even within that context, which isn't necessarily all bad, of course, we spend a lot of time and money gathering data like this, it's still relatively rare that we take into account how real-world social relationships will shape how people think and behave. And so we tend to give people, generic tasks or generic stimulus sets. And when we do consider real-world social relationships at all, we tend to focus on pretty coarse distinctions. So for example, if Mark were a participant in our study, we might compare how his brain responds when he sees Rob, or sees that Rob has won money or has been given a shock or something like that, compared to when Mark sees Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, so someone who might be visually familiar but not personally familiar. And there's been a lot of really, really important work done in this vein that's taught us a lot of it by Ida Gobini and Jim here. Learned a great deal from this work, but I think it's important also not to just focus going forward on relatively coarse distinctions only, and also not to limit the scope of what we investigate to direct social relationships, so relationships between ourselves and others. We know a lot about, for example, third-party relationships, just based on lay intuitions and anecdotal evidence, but there's not that much known about how we represent and operate on that kind of knowledge. And so hopefully I'll be able to convince you in the next 45 minutes or so that if we just focus on coarse distinctions, if we just focus on direct relationships, we might miss a lot of the picture when we're trying to understand social thought and behavior. So really broadly, the common thread that sort of unites the work that I'll tell you about throughout the talk is that it's focused on the interaction between our cognition and behavior as individuals and the webs of social relationships that we all inhabit. Both how we represent the structure of the social world and how that relates to how we might represent and think about other domains of knowledge, like spatial relationships, for example, and also interactions between cognition and behavior of individuals and the social networks that they inhabit. And I think that understanding these kinds of questions is really important just for understanding some everyday mundane aspects of human thought and behavior. You can imagine, for example, you're walking down Main Street here in Hanover and you bump into someone you know, as one does on Main Street in Hanover, how much attention you pay to this person. So if you stop to say hello, if she catches your eye, also things like how much you might trust her, what you might speak about with her if you were to stop to say hello. These things all depend in part on aspects of her as an individual. So maybe her appearance, your knowledge of her personality traits or her likes and dislikes, or what social category she seems to belong to. But how you perceive and interact with her is also going to depend on your own relationship with her. So maybe how close the two are. Is she a stranger, a friendly acquaintance, a really close friend? Also roles or status, so is she an undergrad in one of your classes? Is she your boss? So of course it's not just our knowledge of individuals in isolation that shape our behavior. There's also aspects of our direct relationships. But then it also gets more complicated because we each have our own sets of social ties, then those people are connected to each other and to others, so we're all embedded in these rich fabrics of social relations. And information about where somebody sits in our social networks can have real and important consequences for behavior. So for example, some people will be better connected than others in a network, as Talia alluded to. Now there might be more pronounced reputation costs, for example, for divulging sensitive information or for wronging that person. And some people have even argued that the cognitive demands of sort of tracking and encoding and remembering the social relationships in our big, complexly bonded social groups was an exceptionally significant force in human brain evolution. And so whether or not that's right, it seems to be clear that this is information we're concerned with all the time. It seems to be really important to us. And at the same time, we still don't know a lot about how people understand and shape and how they're shaped by the social networks that they inhabit. So with this in mind, the work that I'll tell you about falls into two broad categories. First, probing how people represent social relations and how that relates to other domains of knowledge, like spatial relations. And then second, relating individual cognition behavior to where they sit in the social networks they inhabit. So in the interest of time, I'll focus predominantly on work in the second category, since I think it's more in line with the theme of this week. First, I'll really briefly touch on a couple studies or examples of work that fall into this first category, just to give you a sense of it in case anyone wants to talk more about it in the next couple of days, and because I think it's relevant to understanding how we represent and navigate our social world in everyday life, albeit using pretty abstract and maybe non-naturalistic stimuli. So in the past, we've done things like, as Matt alluded to, testing if the brain represents distances from the self in social ties, in space and in time in a similar way. So for example, we've shown people pictures of objects that get progressively closer or farther from you in space, pictures of people who become progressively more or less familiar or close in terms of social ties, or phrases that refer to the progressively more immediate or more remote future. And we found, using cross-classification and RSA approaches that Mark spoke about very eloquently yesterday, that in some regions with a well-established role in representing the physical space around oneself, like the anterior IPL, there seems to be a common neural encoding of different kinds of distances from the self. So there's one neural signature, you could say, for close time, close space, people who are close to you in terms of social ties, and then a different distinct neural signature for far time, far space, less familiar others. And so this is consistent with the idea that we might speak about more abstract social relationship knowledge, or rather more abstract social knowledge, like about relationships, in terms of space, because we might think of it that way. And in other ongoing work, we're investigating other ways that there might be some interesting parsimony in how our brains represent and operate on social knowledge. For example, in one study, we've been looking at how information is organized in a region of the superior parietal cortex with a well-established role in directing attentional shifts in space. So this is a really simple schematic. So we know from prior work, this area encodes the direction of attentional shifts or eye movements in the physical space around oneself. So there's one neural pattern for shifting attention up, for example, and a different distinct neural signature for shifting attention down. And in simple spatial attention tasks, then we can, have people follow a target around a screen, measure their eye movements, and then correctly classify the direction of those eye movements based on response patterns in this region. And we're finding that response patterns in this region also encode shifts of attention in external space in the same way as internal sort of shifts of attention, so within mental representations of social knowledge. So to unpack this a bit, We can characterize activity patterns when you're shifting your attention upwards and downwards in space in a simple eye movement task, and then during a totally different task where you're not moving your eyes and you're not actually seeing anything, but you have to reason about a social hierarchy you've previously learned about. So just to clarify, this isn't what people are seeing. They're not seeing anything. It's just sort of what we think might be going on in their heads. It's just sort of a visual shorthand, I guess. We're seeing that patterns of activity when you're shifting attention upward in space for most people look like patterns of activity when you're trying to figure out who's a given number of steps above someone else in a social hierarchy, and shifts of attention downward in space for most people look like activity patterns when you're trying to figure out who's a given number of steps below a given individual in a social hierarchy they've learned about. So this suggests that we might use partially shared neural mechanisms to sort of shift our attention in external space and to sort of shift our attention in internal and perhaps spatially organized mental representations of social knowledge. So it's not just that people represent this kind of social relationship knowledge spatially. So for example, in a post-scan task, if we just give people a grid and tell them to just drag their faces in whatever way they think reflects how much power they have in the hierarchy, most people do something like this and organize them vertically. The circle size just reflects the position of that person in the hierarchy. That's not what they saw. It's just the faces would be meaningless to you because you haven't seen the hierarchy. So we just overlaid those for you, or rather you haven't learned the hierarchy. And although there's some variation, so a couple people organize things horizontally, a couple of people do sort of a mix of the two. Most people organize them vertically. Everyone seems to have a clear kind of spatial arrangement they use. And looking at the neural pattern suggests that when reasoning about social relationship knowledge, it's as if we're shifting our attention within these spatially organized representations of social knowledge. So those are a couple examples of work we've done where we're trying to understand how our brains represent and reason about social relationships. They often involve kind of artificial tasks and stimuli, in part because in order to match up things across domains, you have to control them and constrain them a great deal. So today I want to primarily concentrate on work in the second category, where we focus on understanding how information processing and behavior within individuals relates to the social networks that they inhabit. And so to answer questions in the second category, an approach we often take is getting members of a bounded community like a business school or a dorm, or in one case a village, and getting everybody in that community to just tell us who their friends are, sometimes through online questionnaires. And then using that information, if we get everybody in the community to do that, we can reconstruct their social network. So the circles here are people, the lines are friendships between them. And doing this allows us to get a rich set of information about these people without really having to clue them into what a subsequent might be about, and without having to ask them much at all just beyond who their friends are. So we can see, for example, who's a hub, who tends to bridge between different groups, as Talia mentioned. Also things like who's a given number of degrees of separation from someone else. And then we can have some of these people or all of these people come into the lab, do neuroimaging studies or behavioral studies. And then this allows us to ask questions like, how much do people know about where others sit in their social networks? And do they retrieve this knowledge spontaneously just when they encounter somebody who they know? And to sort of prepare them to behave in an appropriate and beneficial way. And there's reason to believe this might be the case. So this might sound kind of far-fetched at first, but there's evidence that other aspects of person knowledge are spontaneously retrieved when you encounter other people, like knowledge of their personality traits or behavioral tendencies. And the purpose of activating this knowledge is thought to be sort of preparing you for effective and beneficial social interactions. So you can sort of, with minimal feeling of effort, kind of shift gears depending on who you happen to be around. And so similarly, information about social ties, like whether someone's a friend or a friend of a friend or how well connected they are, these things also likely inform our behavior and perceptions. And so as I alluded to at the beginning of my talk, while there's been a lot of great research looking at kind of responses to, for example, friends versus strangers, there isn't much known about how we encode and are influenced by more nuanced social relationship information about familiar others, even though these are the people, so you know your colleagues, your acquaintances, your friends with whom most of your everyday social interactions probably take place. And so to get at this, we, as Talia described, took members of a first-year cohort in the business school program here at Dartmouth, so about 300 people, and just got them to answer this question, essentially, who do you socialize with regularly? And this was an in-class activity they didn't know would be related to an fMRI study they'd be recruited for later. And then using that information, we can reconstruct the social network of the cohort. So the circles here are students, lines are mutually reported friendships between them. And the properties of such a big and densely connected network are kind of hard to visualize when showing everything all at once. It kind of looks like an ugly hairball or something like that. So I'm just going to go through some of the key properties that Talia also mentioned that we're interested in using a simpler toy diagram of just 13 people. And so one important question is social distance, and that's pretty easy to get at. So you can take anybody in the network like Tim or Mary and see who's directly connected, so who's distance of 1. And also we can see who she's 2 degrees of separation from, like Luke, so it's just like playing the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon game. You can play this game for everybody in the network and map out how far or how close they are to Mary. And you can imagine how this might shape Mary's behavior, so the actions and thoughts, mental states of these people might be more relevant to her than people who are farther away from her in the network, and she might be more likely to, for example, tune into them. We can extract other information from the patterning of ties here as well, like who's well-connected to well-connected others. And this might be particularly important for humans because for us, our power to influence other people and to sway things like conflict resolution or resource allocation, it doesn't just depend on who's strongest or who's most dominant. It doesn't just depend on who knows the most or who's most prestigious. If you have a lot of people who support you, who in turn have a lot of people who support them, you gain a certain kind of power or status. And so we define social status here in terms of eigenvector centrality, so essentially how well connected you are to well-connected others. So the people with big numbers here are kind of big fish in big ponds socially. So take Bob here, even though Bob and Tim both have 4 connections, Bob's number is bigger because his friends are better connected. So this is sort of similar to how Google decides what pages to rank first when you do a web search. So just like a link from my web page to yours isn't as valuable to the search ranking as a link from the New York Times or your web page, Bob's link to Jane is a lot more valuable to him than Tim's link to Amy. And a third important aspect of sociality we can extract from patterns of ties in this network is who tends to connect otherwise disparate people in the network. So in other words, who occupies a minimally constrained network position. So these people serve as sort of social bridges or brokers. So you can think of somebody like Tim here, who maybe in high school was the sort of person who might be friends with people in lots of different cliques. In contrast, Lisa only has friends who are already friends with each other. So compared to Lisa, Tim's more likely to be sort of a social chameleon who might shift his attention depending on who he happens to be around, and he's also more likely to get more diverse information. So we can characterize everybody in the network in terms of how constrained they are, and of course we all vary on how constrained we are, how well connected we are. We're closer to some people than we are to others, and so these features build up a lot of the structure of our social sphere. So we can take every person in the network, characterize them in terms of these attributes, and as I said before, this allows us to get a lot of information about these people without cluing them into what the study's about or asking them much just beyond who do you socialize with regularly. And then we took 21 people out of this network, so the nodes you see in peach here, and had them come in for an fMRI study. And then for each fMRI participant, we can look at the network from their perspective and see who's 1, 2, or 3 degrees away from them in the network. And then we tailor-made a stimulus set for each person. So the 2 highest and lowest eigenvector centrality individuals at each of 3 distances from them in the network. So the 2 smallest and largest circles at each layer represented here by these silhouettes. And then for everybody in the stimulus set, we had a short video of them saying essentially the same thing, which we showed to participants in the scanner. So they just watched videos like this with a fixation cross in between, and their job is just press a button if you see the same person twice in a row, just to make sure they're not falling asleep, as sometimes happens in fMRI studies. And then after scanning, there was a questionnaire that probed how accurately they perceived the network characteristics of the people who they'd seen. And so looking at that data from the post-scan questionnaire, so each line's a participant, the y-axes are perceptions, the x-axes are reality. You can see in all three graphs there's a pretty clear positive relationship. So as you can see, people have pretty accurate knowledge of where others sit in their social networks. But is this knowledge automatically encoded when we see these people? So to get at this, we used a searchlight approach where we moved a sphere throughout each person's brain, and then at each point in the brain, we extract patterns from a sphere centered on that point and generated by each person in the stimulus set. And then we use those patterns to construct a neural dissimilarity matrix that captures the distinctions that this brain region makes, or in other words, how it organizes information. So what it treats as the same, what it treats as different, essentially, and by how much. And then we can go back to the social network data and we can construct dissimilarity matrices based on those three aspects of social network position that I mentioned earlier. And now, because we've summarized the data in a way that sort of abstracted away from how we acquired it, so as Mark mentioned, second order isomorphism, we just have 12 by 12 matrices indexed by target. We can do things like take a neural similarity structure at any given point in the brain and then model it as a weighted combination of these social network position-derived similarity structures. And so now we can do things like see what kinds of social network information might be carried in different brain regions. So just to situate you, in orange is where the regression coefficient for eigenvector centrality is significantly positive. Purple is distance and green is constraint. And without getting into too much kind of speculative reverse inference about the localization of these findings, you can see that some of these results point to sort of automatic hypotheses about the kinds of processes that might be differentially triggered or influenced by different facets of social network position. For example, among other things, some of these regions that seem to encode eigenvector centrality are involved in representing others' mental states or theory of mind, suggesting that the possibility that being really well-connected others might have consequences for how much other people attend to what you seem to be thinking about. And I'll just quickly tell you about a behavioral study where we're testing this notion. So one simple way to measure attention to others' mental states is with gaze cueing paradigms. And in case anyone's not familiar with those, I'll just quickly breeze through what they entail. So the participant's job is just to look at the center of the screen and indicate whether a target, indicated by this T here, appears on the right or the left side of the screen. And the only catch is that right before the target appears, a face appears, gazing to the left or to the right. And even though the direction of the face has nothing to do with where the target will appear, and participants know this, they're faster to correctly respond about its location when the cueing face had just been looking in the direction where it later appeared. So in the valid trial shown up top here, compared to when the face had just been looking in the other direction, so in the invalid trial shown on the bottom here. And the gaze cueing effect, so you being faster to respond correctly on invalid compared to valid, or valid compared to invalid trials, arises because we automatically track and shift our attention towards what other people seem to be thinking about or where they seem to be attending. So the strength of this effect reflects how much you're attending to someone else's apparent mental state. And so if we do attend more to the apparent mental state of people who are especially well connected in our social networks, then these people's faces should elicit particularly strong gaze cueing effects. So to test this, we characterized a different group, this time a sorority, had as many of them as possible come in to get photographed for a stimulus set for a gaze cueing study where the participants were their fellow group members. And I'll just show you some of the key results. So on the y-axis, you'll see the strength of the gaze cueing effect The x-axis will be how well connected the cueing face is to well-connected others. And you can see that better connected people are eliciting stronger gaze cueing effects. And this fits with past work showing that in humans and also in other group living primates, social attention is modulated by social status, but where status is typically defined in terms of dominance, so faces that look more masculine, who might be a particularly formidable physical opponent. This is thought to happen because highly dominant people or people who are high status in that way are especially behaviorally relevant, so it's particularly important to attend to what they might be thinking about, what they might do next, monitor and predict that kind of information. And so like dominant, social network centrality seems to modulate social attention. And I think this really makes sense if you think about it, because people who are really well connected in your social network are really influential when it comes to things like spreading norms, sort of spreading information, shaping reputations, and these kinds of concerns might be particularly behaviorally relevant for the kinds of people who are participants in our studies, so usually students on college campuses, than physical dominance. So to quickly sum up this work before moving on to the last study that I'll tell you about, so people have pretty accurate knowledge of where people sit in their social networks. We retrieve this knowledge spontaneously when we encounter familiar people, and consistent with the notion that the reason we spontaneously retrieve any kind of person knowledge at all when we see a face is to prepare us to think and act in an appropriate and beneficial way. Social network centrality seems to gate social network centrality seems to gate social attention in humans, such that we pay more attention to what well-connected people seem to be thinking about. And in ongoing work, we're looking at many other ways that familiar others' network positions might impact social thought and behavior, like pro-social decision-making, interpersonal trust, and so on. And so in the last study that I'll tell you about, so this also falls into the second category of work here, we sort of took a slightly different approach and instead asked if people who are closer together in their social network respond to the world more similarly. So many of us have the intuition, right, that birds of a feather flock together. We're friends with people who are like us. This is not a new intuition. It goes back at least to the 1500s. Sociologists have confirmed this across many cultures and contexts. Humans tend to be surrounded by other people who are like them in terms of a whole range of factors, such as age, gender, and so on. And it's been suggested that homophily, so literally love of the same, might benefit us because similar people are likely to share similar goals, experiences, and assumptions, and so it might facilitate things like collective action, cohesion, and empathy. But this kind of explanation hasn't really been tested directly. And in the same vein, you might have the intuition that your friends aren't just people who fulfill certain demographic checkboxes, like same height, check, same gender, check, same age, check. Within certain demographic groups, they resonate with some people more than others. Hopefully, you have some friends who fall into different demographic groups than your own. But until relatively recently, most of the work on homophily has been focused on these relatively coarse variables like demographics. Despite the perception that a lot of us have that our friends who we sort of click with, who see the world like we do, and who sort of respond to things in a similar way to ourselves. And so here we want to test this notion. And as we've seen this week, one window into how we respond to the world, so into our thoughts, our emotions, also we allocate our attention, these processes unfold, can be provided by neural response time series to dynamic naturalistic stimuli. So as you all know by now, because we've seen such amazing work this week in this vein, if you take a group of people's brains, align them to a common anatomical grid, and show them rich movie or something, and then you extract time series neural responses as from corresponding brain regions, those responses become sort of locked together in time. The similarity of their neural responses, depending on the region, reflects things like the similarity of their interpretations, their emotional responses, what they focus on and tend to, how captivated they might be, and so on. And so if we are exceptionally similar to our friends and to people who are closer to us in our social networks in how we respond to the world, then we should expect neural responses to rich naturalistic stimuli to be exceptionally similar among friends than among people who have the chance but don't befriend each other. So we characterized a new academic cohort and again had a subset come in for an fMRI study, so the nodes you see in red here, where they just watched a bunch of videos while we scanned them. We had a few criteria for picking the videos, so we wanted things people hadn't seen before. We didn't want similarities among friends to be inflated just because they'd watched the same things together before. We also wanted things that would be engaging, both to hopefully evoke a lot of the affective and cognitive processes that characterize your everyday mental life, and also to minimize mind wandering or stimulus undirected thought, because that would be a source of noise. So we want to minimize intersubject variability due to things just unrelated to the experiment, but we didn't want to squelch intersubject variability completely. So we didn't want to show them something that's incredibly effective at locking them into a shared sequence of neural states and attentional trajectories, like some of the masterfully directed films by Hitchcock or Spielberg do, which are often used in intersubject correlation studies. We wanted videos that would induce some meaningful variability in people's response time courses, because different people might interpret them differently, might attend to different aspects of them, or might have different emotional responses to them. So we wanted videos that minimized uninformative intersubject variability by being engaging and new, but would maximize intersubject variability that would be more interesting to us. And so we used a pretty heterogeneous set of videos. For example, we had some things that some people might find really adorable and sweet and touching. Others might find kind of cloying or overly sentimental or sappy. We had examples of different kinds of comedy, some of which might appeal to people with a certain sense of humor, but not others who might fail to appreciate or in some cases even detect the humor in. We had examples of kind of pretty sophomore, low-brow humor, also slapstick, physical comedy, as well as more wry, cringe-based comedies, clips from documentaries that it turns out not everyone realized were mockumentaries and not documentaries. We had things that some people might find really interesting, other people might find comparatively dull arguments that some people might really resonate with, but others might respond to with skepticism or even contempt or counter-arguing. And so just to give you a sense of the nature of the subject's experience in the scanner, I'll show you some clips or some excerpts from clips that we showed them. In the interest of time, I've shortened these to just be a few seconds each, but in the study they were like a few minutes long for the most part. So,
when I was outside on my first spacewalk, I was on the dark side of the world over the Indian Ocean. I had to work for one thing. It was very easy to the water squeezes and the surface is insulting when a coach is making 5 to 10 to 15 times more. These babies are not strong enough to play, and they fall to the ground repeatedly. You know, the funny side of it, and I turned to the rescue workers and I said, "Talk about rough day work." Referring to spending time up there, a rough day work.
not everyone got that was fake. I don't know why. But anyway, so again, each clip was much longer than that. So here's data from 2 people sped up a lot, so 4 times speed. Maybe we can pretend we have nice temporal resolution with fMRI for a minute. But it looks a little smoother than it actually is. But so up top you can see 2 rings for friends, the voxel, so it's just relative activity response level within that voxel over time. And then below, just from the video you're seeing at the top, mean activity level the right superior temporal cortex mask. And you can see that, for example, within this ROI, there's a fair degree of people are rising and falling together pretty clearly over time. And so the way we get the data of the sort at the bottom here is we just took each person's anatomical scan, just did tissue segmentation with FreeSurfer, and then made a cortical model of each participant's brain, and then just used FreeSurfer-derived cortical parcellation to generate 80 anatomical regions of interest. Oops. So in a more kind of toy way, here you can see that as participants watch the videos, we just extract time series of neural responses from each of these brain regions, and then we can correlate the time series from corresponding brain regions across participants. And so we have 80 brain regions, so this gives us for each of our 861 dyads a vector with 80 elements that captures their neural response similarity across these brain regions. And we can go back to the neural data, or rather the social network data, and see if they were friends, so characterized by distance 1, if they were friends of friends, so distance of 2 in the network, or if they're farther removed from each other. And so we can label them accordingly. And so first we wanted to see if we could discern how close together people were in the network based on their patterns of neural response similarity. So on a subset of this data, we trained an SVM learning algorithm to distinguish friends, friends of friends, and so on, based on patterns of neural response similarity. And then we tested if we could give this model new data from pairs of people who it hadn't seen before and tell us whether or not these people are friends, or friends of friends, if they're farther removed from each other in the network. So of course, if there weren't any information about friendship or social distance in this neural response similarity data, we expect a category being guessed about 25% of the time, because we used oversampling the data to get rid of class imbalance, classifier chance to predict every category equally. And this is what we get if we randomly shuffle the labels in our data and perform this analysis many times, as you can see in this histogram. But in the actual data, we see considerably higher prediction rates, as you can see along the diagonal here, with an overall accuracy rate of about 40%, so significantly above 25%. So we can predict the distance between two people based on their neural response similarity at a rate well above what you expect based on chance alone. And you can also see in the confusion matrix that as you get farther away from the diagonal, the numbers get lower, suggesting the when the model's getting it wrong, it's guessing, I guess, relatively close to the right answer, although can't really get that far from the right answer because there's only 4 categories. But as you can see, also we had 4 categories of distances in our data. In the interest of time, for the last 3 or 4 minutes of my talk, I'll just hone in on these distance 1 to 3 dyads, but I'm happy to talk more about the distance 4 dyads with anyone who's interested in that later on. So you're probably thinking, okay, you can classify social distance from neural response similarities, but is it the case that people who are closer together in the network are actually responding to what they're seeing more similarly? So we can go back to the vectors we have for each dyad and then group them by social distance. So here, warmer colors are going to mean more similar than average for a given brain region. Cooler colors are going to mean less similar than average for a given brain region. It's okay if these labels are too small to read. The key thing to take away from the data I'll show you on this slide is just the overall broad strokes pattern of results. And then I'll show you the data overlaid on surface models in a minute. Take the distance 3 data, in fact, that across the brain regions that we looked at, these people are responding pretty dissimilarly to one another to what they're seeing. We're seeing warmer colors here for the distance 2 dyads, suggesting that these people who aren't friends with each other but are friends with others' friends are responding to the videos more similarly than people farther removed in the network. And then if we look within friends, we see that people who are friends are responding to what they're seeing in an exceptionally similar way. So I think this matrix shows sort of the pattern of results in general pretty clearly, but the labels are frustratingly hard to read, so we can also project them onto a cortical surface model and see, for example, that in the superior parietal lobule bilaterally, a region we know to be involved in things like allocating attention, friends are especially similar to one another, and the similarity sort of drops off with increasing social distance. These are just descriptive statistics, but I happy to chat more about further analyses we did in this data set to test these kinds of relationships directly. We'll get into some of that in the tutorial as well. But to return to our original question, so do we see the world like our friends do? The results of this last study suggest that yes, there seems to be an interaction between cognition and information processing within individual brains and how our social networks are organized, such that we tend to be surrounded by people who process the world around us exceptionally similarly to how we ourselves do. And so now going forward, we can ask questions like, do we become more similar to our friends over time, sort of align ourselves with them, or do we sort of behave in an assortative way and friend people who are already similar to us? And if both are happening, in what ways are they happening? What kinds of similarities drive friendship formation? What kinds of similarities result from it? We're currently working on longitudinal work to get at this question, as well as more constrained studies that aim to clarify what kinds of processing of what kinds of stimuli might be driving these kinds of effects. And there's also a lot more we can do with this data, some of which you guys are working on in the hackathon, including looking at what facets of the stimuli might be driving the effects we see, looking at aspects of the neural data beyond just region average response similarity, because that was sort of a simple approach as a first pass, but there's obviously a lot more information there. Looking at other facets of network position beyond just geodesic distance between people. So there's a lot more to do here, but I think this is sort of a first proof of concept at least. So to really briefly sum up, because I think I'm running close to my allotted time, hopefully what I've shown you today is that common neural architectures involved in representing and in reasoning about social relations and analogous relationships in other domains like spatial relations. Also, we accurately perceive and spontaneously retrieve information about where other people sit in our real-world social networks, and this information ends up shaping downstream behaviors like how much we attend to what other people seem to be thinking about. And finally, we're beginning to see an interaction where we see our social networks such that we tend to be surrounded by people who process the world like we do. And so I think that by combining these approaches from psychology and neuroscience, and to focus on the individual with methods from sociology and graph theory, like social network analysis, we can open up a lot of really interesting questions. Because I think if we really want to understand social thought and behavior as a world, we really can't treat people just as isolated units or even as dyads interacting and expect to be able to tell the whole story. I think it's pretty clear that a lot of the time what's going on under the hood, so how these people are perceiving and reacting to each other, how they're influencing and being influenced by each other, this often takes into account the broader social networks in which these people are embedded. So with that, thank you for your time and attention, and I'm excited to talk more with you about this in the tutorial, which I think will be after lunch. I guess, do people feel like they have stamina and they want to do it now, or like they, or like they would like lunch?
Let's take a 5 minute. Yeah, thanks, Carolyn, real quick.
Use a questionnaire.
Like people ask their they might have the same as their
Yeah, so we haven't found that, but I guess there's a huge possibility space of questionnaire items to ask people, and it's hard to, I guess, hone in on what would be the right battery of questions, whereas I guess one benefit is at looking at neural responses is you can capture a whole bunch of different processes in parallel, like different kinds of emotional responses, attentional allocation, memory retrieval, that kind of thing, and also how those things rise and fall over time. So maybe two people enjoyed different parts of the same video, for example. So we haven't, I guess, done maybe really rigorous comparison, like had people fill out hundreds and hundreds of questionnaire items and then tested that, but we haven't found that questionnaire items can account for this. And if you account for like demographic similarity and just personality similarity, the results look pretty much the same. Yeah, that would be interesting. Yeah, we haven't done, I guess, like it's similar to some of the analyses we've done where we're looking at, for example, like we did like ordered logistic regression by distance, which is sort of this really similar. We haven't done the exact analysis. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. So with the spontaneous encoding study with the RSA regression, if we include similarity matrices based on big 5 personality traits, the results look essentially the same. So at least insofar as that goes, it doesn't seem like personality knowledge could account for that. I guess I was going to say that it's interesting how little variation in network position characteristics is captured by other kind of canonical individual difference measures. So even a lot of times the correlation between degree centrality and extroversion is like 0.3 or something. So there's a lot of overlap between these constructs, but I think there's also a lot of distinct information that people seem to be tracking.
Have you thought about using some kind of a weight for the adjusted disclosure network, some kind of like closeness factor? Do you think that matters at all?
Yeah, I think probably does matter. We haven't used it. So in a lot of studies, it's really important to really fully characterize the network and get everyone to respond. And one way to do that is keep the questionnaire really short and pay them handsomely for completing it, or ask their professor to demand it of them. No, but so in the interest of the convenience of our participants, we've tended to just use unweighted networks. But I do think you probably would see differences if you were to use weighted ties. Yeah.
All right, let's thank Carolyn.